He was a German corporal, expecting to be executed or enslaved in an American cage of steel, a soldier defeated in his soul. But what he found in a dusty Oklahoma prisoner of war camp, the quiet kindness of a single farmer, didn't take his life. It gave him a purpose that would eventually lead him back to America, to the pulpit, carrying a secret his congregation would never know. For decades he preached forgiveness and love, and his flock never needed to know he had once worn a different uniform. Before Pastor Steiner became the moral cornerstone of a small Pennsylvania community, his heart belonged to the ruins of a collapsed empire, and his future seemed destined for a desolate grave. The final days of 1944 found him shivering in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. A 21-year-old corporal named Friedrich Steiner, better known as Fritz, who had seen enough combat to know the war was over, even if the command structure refused to admit it. The constant roar of artillery had faded into a deep, pervasive silence that Fritz found profoundly unnerving, a silence that felt heavy with impending consequence. He focused only on the cold, hoping the intense physical discomfort would distract him from the moral collapse he was enduring. Fritz and his remaining squad, 6 exhausted, freezing men, had been cut off near Bastogne, their supply lines rendered useless by relentless aerial attack. The forest floor was a slick ruin of mud and snow, and the only sound, louder than the sporadic, terrifying artillery fire, was the grinding certainty of defeat. He carried a rifle that felt useless and a mind full of propaganda that had failed him entirely. For years, the Reich had drilled one truth into him: surrender to the Americans meant a fate worse than any battlefield. They were told of capture camps where prisoners were beaten, starved, and systematically humiliated until they were rendered lifeless or sent to forced labor until they collapsed. Every German soldier believed that if they were caught, they would meet a violent end, or at best be made to experience hardship that stole their humanity. When the inevitable happened, it was neither cinematic nor heroic. Fritz and his men stumbled directly into a perimeter held by the 101st Airborne Division. They were too cold and too hungry to run. Fritz dropped his rifle, bracing for the inevitable rifle butt to the ribs or the crack of a pistol. But the violence he expected never came. Instead, a young American medic, barely older than Fritz himself, handed him a field ration, a small, wax-wrapped block of chocolate. Fritz stared at the chocolate. It was rich, dark, and utterly impossible. He hadn't seen proper chocolate in months. Back home, that block represented a week's ration for a family. He pocketed it instantly, still too suspicious to eat it. This wasn't the monster he had been taught to fear. This was just a boy with tired eyes offering sugar. The long walk behind the front lines was a procession of utter shock. As they were marched past makeshift American field hospitals, Fritz saw wounded German soldiers being tended to by American nurses, their wounds cleaned and bandaged just the same as their own men. The entire scene contradicted years of fervent propaganda. A quiet, terrifying question began to form in Fritz's mind. If the enemy was this efficient and this calm, why were they fighting them at all? The final destination was a transit hub deep behind the lines where hundreds of German prisoners were being processed with a dispassionate, industrial efficiency. Names were checked against lists, clothes were exchanged for plain, nondescript uniforms. He was treated like inventory, not an ideological enemy, a methodical approach that was perhaps the greatest shock of all. The machine of war had captured him, but the machine was indifferent, lacking the hatred he had been promised. Fritz stood in line, watching the routine, realizing he was a number in a vast, well-oiled machine. There was no shouting, no cruelty, only logistics. When a sergeant handed him a slip of paper with the words Camp Stillwater, Oklahoma, typed upon it, Fritz's fear became confusion. Oklahoma. It sounded like something out of a pulp novel, an alien and unimaginable place. He had expected a prison cell beneath the ruins of Europe, not a journey across an entire ocean. He was loaded into a warm boxcar, traveling toward a complete unknown. The journey across the vast alien landscape of America was a dizzying blur of mountains, endless plains, and industrial might. The train finally slowed outside Stillwater, Oklahoma, and when the heavy steel doors were pushed back, the sight that greeted Friedrich Steiner challenged every fearful lesson he had ever learned. Instead of the cold, grim fortress he had anticipated, he saw a sprawling, orderly collection of low-slung wooden barracks. The air smelled of fresh pine lumber, not fear. The unexpected warmth of the climate and the quiet order of the camp instantly dissolved his worst fears of brutal cold and torture. Camp Stillwater was one of over 500 prisoner-of-war camps established across the United States. By 1945, the United States was holding nearly 400,000 Axis prisoners. The sheer logistics of managing this massive prison population demanded a cold, effective efficiency, but that efficiency produced conditions that were, to men like Fritz, astonishing. The barracks were clean, heated, and the rules were strict but fair. The most immediate shock was the food. The first meal was served in a brightly lit mess hall, thick beef stew, fresh bread, butter, and coffee. Compare this abundance to the harsh reality of the German home front. Each prisoner was legally entitled to approximately 3,200 calories a day. Fritz sat staring at the plate. The richness, the unbelievable abundance felt like a deliberate test. The enemy, he realized with a sinking heart, was feeding him better than his own army ever had. He wondered if the goal was not to starve them, but to shame them with kindness, a subtle moral torture. The purpose of this order soon became clear. The United States Army, while honoring the Geneva Conventions, was severely lacking in agricultural and industrial labor. The prisoners of war were to be used as labor, kept busy, productive, and well-behaved. This was the final, devastating contrast to the Reich's promises, the absence of malice. The guards were distant, not cruel. The system was focused on logistics, not vengeance. Fritz had been trained to hate a monster, yet here was a nation so confident it could afford to treat its enemies with bureaucratic dignity. Now, assigned to a permanent work detail, Fritz would soon face the ordinary Americans who had volunteered to be his temporary keepers. The camp gate opened one morning, and Fritz and 3 other prisoners were loaded into the back of a rattling pickup truck driven by Elias Vance, the elderly, deeply religious farmer who would become Fritz's unexpected moral guide. Elias Vance's small dairy farm was miles from Stillwater. The German men had expected brutal labor. Instead, Elias Vance treated them with a distant, almost formal courtesy. The only guard was a single, bored private, whose presence was less a threat and more a compliance measure. Elias Vance never spoke of the war, though his own son, a United States Army engineer, had lost his life in Italy a year earlier. His grief was visible only in the deep lines around his eyes. He communicated through simple gestures. Clean the stalls, mend the fence, milk the brown cow. Fritz found the rhythm of farm life profoundly therapeutic. The smell of clean hay and honest dirt was a welcome replacement for the stench of gunpowder and fear he had carried for years. The most terrifying aspect of the assignment was the trust. Elias Vance handed Fritz and the others pitchforks, hammers, and saws. He gave them access to the barn and the fields. They were often unsupervised for long stretches. Yet the question of escape was secondary to a moral dilemma. Elias Vance had trusted them with his livelihood. This absence of armed guards created a higher moral tension than any locked door. To betray that trust felt somehow worse than simply being recaptured. In the quiet evenings back at the camp, Fritz found solace in a battered German-language Bible. He realized that the simple dignity Elias Vance extended, the quiet expectation of honest work, was more powerful than any chain. This profound, unspoken kindness chipped away at Fritz's conditioning. Soon that quiet test of character would lead to a small, profound invitation that would shake the very foundations of his faith. The simple clinking of a fork against porcelain became, for Fritz Steiner, the sound of a universe shifting. It was a cold, blustery Sunday afternoon, and after months of working in silent respect, Elias Vance had simply pointed toward the porch. "Come inside, son. Supper's ready." That single, casual invitation was the most shocking order Fritz had received since his capture. The Vance kitchen was a sanctuary of warmth and domestic peace. Mistress Vance, a woman with kind eyes, simply offered a small nod. Fritz sat at the long wooden table surrounded by the Vance family. Before the meal began, Elias Vance bowed his head and offered a simple, powerful grace, speaking of hope for peace across all lands. Fritz could not recall a moment of such authentic, non-political reverence since before the Reich seized power. It was a profound symbol of the life he never knew. As the plates were passed, Mistress Vance laid a fresh slice of pie, pecan, and sweet on his plate. "We have plenty." In that act, the entire edifice of German propaganda, which had painted Americans as greedy, materialistic factory slaves, began to crumble. Here was bounty freely shared, even with the men who had sought to bring harm to their sons. Fritz found himself unable to reconcile the monstrous images from home with the quiet, dignified piety he saw before him at this farmhouse table. Fritz ate slowly. He realized the Vances were not performing charity. They were acting out of a conviction of neighborliness that transcended nationality. This meal was the most profound piece of psychological warfare. It wasn't the tanks or the bombers that broke his spirit. It was the quiet confidence of a family sharing their Sunday dinner. Fritz realized he wasn't detested, he was simply seen. Later, as he walked back toward the gate with the guard, the quiet realization settled heavily upon him. The monster he had been taught to hate was not real. Instead, he had met a nation of ordinary people who valued simple dignity. That night, the memory of the shared grace, the pecan pie, and the farmer's silent faith ignited a tiny, persistent spark within him. The moral vacuum left by the collapse of his ideological beliefs was slowly being filled by something new. Recognizing the spiritual despair in the camp, Fritz began a small worship service. He stood behind a repurposed wooden table and spoke of forgiveness, shared suffering, and the quiet endurance of faith. He found profound release in teaching men that their failures on the battlefield did not diminish their worth before God, offering a vital balm to their collective guilt and trauma. His services quickly grew. He was noticed by Captain Lewis, the camp's American chaplain. Captain Lewis, seeing Fritz's natural gift, supplied him with proper theological texts. The American chaplain, who had every reason to view Fritz as an enemy, instead saw him as a nascent spiritual leader. Captain Lewis guided Fritz's studies, focusing on the history of Christianity and the power of reconciliation. This mentorship was the ultimate act of American confidence, investing in the moral rehabilitation of its captives. For Fritz, it solidified his realization. His future lay not in weapons, but in words. He was a student of grace, learning a new kind of authority built on service, not command. This quiet intellectual nurturing showed Fritz that his enemies saw a future for him beyond the war, providing hope where only ruin had been promised. This new purpose gave him strength to face the inevitable news from Europe. The spring air over Oklahoma was thick with the scent of blossoming pecan trees, but the atmosphere inside Camp Stillwater was charged with an electric uncertainty. News, initially filtering in as rumors, then confirmed by hushed radio broadcasts, announced the total collapse of the Reich and the end of the European War. The prisoners felt a confusing mix of immediate relief that the conflict was finally over and existential dread for the fate of their families back home in the ruins. The news was met with profound, stunned silence. For the German prisoners, it meant the terrifying prospect of returning to a nation they knew only as ruins. Fritz felt the complex weight of the moment, relief that the bloodshed had ceased, and a chilling apprehension about the future. Many men openly worried about starvation, knowing the meager rations that awaited them in occupied German cities. The American authorities began processing the prisoners. This was Fritz's final week on the Vance farm. On his last afternoon, Elias Vance stood by the barn. He simply extended his hand, calloused and firm, and shook Fritz's hand. "You worked hard, Fritz," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "You earned your keep." Then Elias Vance pulled something small and worn from his overalls. It was a pocket-sized King James Bible. "Take this," Elias Vance said simply. "You've got the call in you. Don't let the rubble take it away." Fritz took the book, his fingers tracing the embossed title. The weight of this simple, worn book was greater than any medal. It was a physical testament to the reconciliation that had occurred. As the truck rolled away, Fritz gripped the Bible tightly. He looked back at the farmhouse, understanding that the greatest loss of the war was not the physical destruction, but the years spent believing that human compassion was a weakness. He carried the farmer's Bible, convinced that the moral victory he had witnessed in America was the only thing that could rebuild Germany. The journey home was long and sobering. No amount of reading could have prepared Friedrich Steiner for Bremerhaven in the winter of 1946. The cold, wet wind carried the acrid scent of burnt brick and despair. The devastation was absolute. Not a single pane of glass or stretch of cobbled road remained whole in the port city, signaling the complete failure of the Reich. Fritz stepped onto the dock. His family home was gone. His parents, he learned, had passed away. Fritz stood before the ruins. In this moment of utter personal loss, he realized the material destruction was merely the symptom of a deeper moral vacuum. He felt a profound responsibility to bring the moral clarity he found in America back to his traumatized people. Fritz immediately began working as an interpreter for the Allied occupation forces. His fluent English, learned from Captain Lewis, was immensely valuable. He carried himself with quiet dignity, applying the Vance family's rule: simple, honest work and respect for all, to the massive, intractable problems of post-war reconstruction. Yet his true calling was the broken spirits of his people. He realized the only permanent reconstruction must be spiritual. He made a vow: he would return to the source of his renewal. He would go back to America and formally pursue the ministry, committing his life to the reconciliation he had witnessed between enemies. The return journey, this time as an immigrant rather than a prisoner, was fraught with the anxiety of a second chance. 3 years after he ceased his efforts to fight for the fatherland, Friedrich Steiner stood on a freighter bound for New York, now an immigrant sponsored by Captain Lewis. He landed in the States feeling like a ghost, ready to shed the shadow of his past and embrace his new identity, which required immense personal courage. Life as a seminary student was rigorous, lonely, and humbling. Fritz was poor, but his poverty was voluntary. Yet a shadow followed him, the secret of his past. The decision to return was a high-stakes gamble. To reveal his past could mean instant rejection and deportation. He chose to build his life on the truth of his conversion. He dedicated himself to his studies. His sermons on reconciliation were profoundly moving. Upon graduation, he accepted a call to lead a small, rural congregation in Pennsylvania. He formally adopted Steiner, severing the last tie to his military past. He stepped into the pulpit, ready to dedicate his life to forgiveness. Decades had indeed passed, flowing like the quiet river that bordered the small Midwestern town where Pastor Friedrich Steiner had built his life. It was 1985, and Pastor Steiner, now 71, was the very bedrock of his community. His face was etched with the lines of a life well lived and well loved, but his eyes still held the deep, reflective sorrow that only those who have witnessed war truly carry. His past, the silent burden of Corporal Fritz Steiner of the German Wehrmacht, remained securely sealed beneath the mantle of his ministry. On this particular Sunday morning, the air in the sanctuary was warm and fragrant with lilies. Pastor Steiner stood in the pulpit delivering a sermon on the theme of reconciliation, a topic he approached not through abstract theology but with the quiet, desperate sincerity of a man who had sought and found it in the most unexpected places. As he spoke, his gaze swept over the congregation, his eyes habitually cataloging the familiar faces. Then they snagged on a new one, an elderly visitor seated near the back, a man with a stern, angular profile and a quiet intensity in his bearing. George Peterson. The name didn't register at first, but the man did. There was an unnerving familiarity in the set of his jaw, a sense of having met those deep, knowing eyes before. Pastor Steiner felt a cold flutter in his stomach, the kind of instant, visceral alarm that transcended memory. He forced himself to continue, his voice smooth and controlled, even as his internal world began to fracture. George Peterson, however, was already quite sure. He was visiting his daughter in the area. George had served in the 101st Airborne Division, fighting through the brutal winter hell of the Battle of the Bulge. As the pastor spoke, George didn't focus on the words, but on the voice. The familiar cadence of the accent, refined by decades of American speech, still carried the trace of that fateful German winter, a subtle, lingering ghost in his otherwise flawless American diction. It was the voice of a man he had sought 25 years ago, but ultimately chose to spare. The service concluded, and the line to greet the pastor formed slowly. George waited patiently, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. The pastor's smile, warm and generous, met him. "Thank you for visiting us today," Pastor Steiner said, extending his hand. "I hope you'll return." "I might," George replied, his grip firm. "Pastor," he added, his gaze holding the older man's, "that was a fine sermon, about reconciliation." George leaned in, lowering his voice further until it was just a breath between them, a whisper of a shared, terrifying history. He spoke a single devastating sentence, the German word slicing the quiet air of the vestibule like a stiletto. "Bastogne was a rough winter, wasn't it, camarade?" The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Pastor Steiner's smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, naked terror. His eyes glazed over, staring not at the man before him, but at the snow-covered foxholes of 1944. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a ghastly white. The sudden violent shift to the German word for comrade was a devastating signal, a word used only among brothers in arms. The past had finally come home. He felt 40 years of suppressed fear, of the constant anxiety of exposure, surge through him in a single, terrifying second, culminating in a simple, agonizing truth. George had returned, and this time, he wouldn't be silent. The scent of aged paper and floor polish, usually comforting, now seemed to press the air out of the small office. Pastor Fritz Steiner sank into the visitor's chair, the worn leather creaking a soft confession. Across the desk, George Peterson, the man from the War Crimes Commission, was the embodiment of the final judgment he had dreaded for 4 decades. Fritz's mind was a maelstrom of memories, the gray dust of the Polish campaign, the bitter cold of the Russian front, and the sheer, intoxicating relief of stepping off the U-boat in the Gulf of Mexico 40 years ago. He had lived a life constructed on a single, silent lie, a life of profound goodness built upon a foundation of terrifying deception. George Peterson, however, did not look like a prosecutor. He was an unassuming man in a slightly rumpled suit, his eyes, deep and knowing, watching not a fugitive but a deeply troubled soul. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," Fritz managed, his voice a dry rasp. George gestured toward the desk where a slim file lay open. "The details are precise, Pastor. Corporal Fritz Steiner, captured near Le Havre, September 44. Escaped en route to a POW camp in Maryland. The files confirm your identity and the place of your capture near the coast of Normandy." Fritz confirmed everything. His shoulders slumped as the full, awful truth left his lips. He spoke of the desperate hunger, the stolen uniform, the improbable journey westward. He spoke of his first American friends, Elias Vance, the Oklahoma farmer who saw a lost boy, not a German soldier, and Captain Lewis, the veteran who recognized the flicker of faith in the young corporal and gave him the education that led him to the seminary. The names were touchstones of his stolen, yet profoundly genuine, American life. George listened, nodding slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the file. "I figured," he said, the words cutting through the tension with surprising softness. He closed the file with a gentle thud. "I had a feeling a few years back, the way you speak German for one, and a little digging confirmed the rest. But I never thought to mention it. You seem like a good man, Pastor. The war's been over a long time." That was it. No handcuffs, no sirens, no public shaming, just a quiet acknowledgement of the man and the mercy he had earned. The room had narrowed before, but now it expanded, filled with an unspoken, instantaneous act of grace. George Peterson, perhaps a veteran himself, saw not the enemy uniform, but the man of faith who had devoted his life to selfless service. The two men were now bound by an understanding deeper than law or war. They shared a quiet knowledge of the human capacity for both error and redemption. Fritz sat in stunned silence, tears stinging his eyes. "Mr. Peterson, I don't know what to say." George stood up, walking around the desk. He didn't offer a handshake, but something more intimate. He placed his hand on Fritz's shoulder, a gesture heavy with acceptance. "I won't say anything, Pastor," George said, his voice low and firm. "Your congregation doesn't need to know the uniform you wore then. They only need to know the man you are now." He paused, his gaze steady. "Corporal Steiner is dead, Pastor. The man I see is Pastor Steiner." George left as quietly as he had arrived. He walked out of the office and faded back into the anonymity of the American town, taking the 40-year-old secret with him. Pastor Steiner continued to serve his congregation for another 15 years until his retirement. He stood in the pulpit every Sunday, the immense weight finally lifted. He realized his true life's work was teaching his American community not just the gospel, but a living example of it, that true peace is found not when enemies are finally vanquished, but when their past uniform is finally, quietly, and entirely forgotten. He was a former German corporal who became a shepherd of American souls, and his congregation never needed to ask about his past because he had already preached the only truth that mattered, the unwavering power of forgiveness and the hope of a second chance. The story of Pastor Steiner proves that grace can grow anywhere, even from the ruins of war. If this incredible tale of redemption and second chances restored your faith in humanity, give this video a like and subscribe to join our community for more forgotten stories from history.